We're in the home stretch, and I want to thank all of you again. It really is true what they say about people from Minnesota. You really are much nicer than the people back in. Something goes wrong, nobody yells at me. I should move here, I gotta tell you. I think you're going to enjoy sort of what I honestly can call a big finish. One of our papers that we work with is the Dallas Morning News, and one of their requirements was one of the professors had to be a University of Texas professor, which wasn't unreasonable to ask. So I went to Austin to find the most popular professor. And as soon as I walked on campus and started asking people, Jeremi Suri's name came up over and over and over from every type of person, basically saying, don't leave the school without taking at least one class from Professor Suri. I think you're going to enjoy the next hour on what really is a fascinating topic. And let's get started. Please welcome Jeremi Suri.
Stephen, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to work with One Day University. And it's nice to be back in the Midwest. I taught at the University of Wisconsin for 10 years in Madison. And I've been to this wonderful city many times. I've done a lot of work with the Minnesota Historical Society. How many of you have been to the Minnesota Historical Society? It is probably the best historical society in the country. It really is. It's a remarkable place. Phenomenal archives, a wonderful museum, and they do terrific programming. So I encourage you all to get involved. One of the things I miss most from the Midwest, in addition to my badgers, is the Minnesota Historical Society. So it's good to be back in the Midwest. It's good to see all of you. I'm going to talk about the presidency. I'm a historian. And the central question that I'm interested in today is, I think, a fundamental question about contemporary politics, but it's a historical question as well. How is it possible? Why is it that the presidency has grown so large, so powerful as an institution, but yet we've seen such mediocre results for the past 40 to 50 years? Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, I think you have to say that. Why is it? Why is it that we have so much capability, and we haven't had bad presidents, we've had mediocre presidents? Why have we had mediocre results? Why, for all that we can do in the world and at home, do we seem to be settling for second best? Why is that? Why is that? That's the question I seek to answer today. And it is a historical question, because I think we spend too much time on the personalities in office and not enough time on the changes in the office and the world we live in today. My argument to you today will be about broader historical changes that affect our daily lives that we don't talk enough about. And if we want a better presidency, and we want better policy, I will argue, we need to talk about these broader institutional changes, not just the personalities or the foibles of the individuals, too many individuals who are running for this office. So let me start with a little story. It's a story of two presidents. You'll very quickly know who I'm talking about. These two men entered office during the worst economic downturn in recent memory. When these two men came into office in very different eras, no one really could remember a time that had been more difficult economically. High unemployment, fear that the economy was careening out of control. One of the strange things about an economy is you have long periods of stability when things just seem to be working, and then all of a sudden everything seems to crash at the same time. You all remember this in 2008, right? I mean, you never would have thought that your banks would be at risk, and all of a sudden your banks were at risk, right? Numbers of people lost their retirement money that they thought was in the most secure investments, right? The economy seemed so stable, but then it took a rapid dive before both of these presidents came into office. They both also faced emerging threats abroad. Leaders overseas, governments overseas, that didn't directly threaten American territory, or so they thought they didn't, but that threatened American interests abroad. Extremists, groups that were using violence in ways that had not been used before. Both of these presidents were elected largely because they were not their predecessors. They were elected as the opposite of their predecessors, because their predecessors were seen as having failed, seen as having contributed, or at least not solved the problems that they had faced. And both of these presidents, and people will forget this about the first one, both of these presidents faced enormously strong opposition. Despite the fact that they were popular when elected, that they won big victories because they were not their predecessor, they faced strong opposition because, as everyone in this room knows, and as I remind my undergraduates, just because you're elected president doesn't mean people in Congress and the Supreme Court want to do what you want to do. In fact, often it's quite different. Both of these presidents faced enormous opposition, sometimes from their own party, because they were, in a sense, outsiders. They faced opposition from the Supreme Court. It's the Supreme Court's job to hold presidents accountable to the Constitution, which might differ from the policies they wish to pursue. One of a recurring theme is that some of our best presidents have often been the ones who have pushed constitutional limits, by the way. I will talk about one of those in a second. And both of these presidents faced opposition from extreme voices in the media. In one era, it was radio. In another era, radio, television, and social media. My students, by the way, have trouble remembering or believing there was a time without social media. And in fact, radio to them is just something you turn on in the car. Otherwise, it doesn't exist as such. The two men I'm talking about are, of course, Franklin Roosevelt and Barack Obama. Here we have President Roosevelt. Roosevelt was elected in 1933 in the midst of what was the worst economic challenge in American history. American unemployment was above 25%, above 25%, that's the reported unemployment rate, and most women did not work. So think of how few Americans are actually working. It was a period when bank runs had become standard. The first thing President Roosevelt did, the first thing he did was to close the banks, all the banks, so people couldn't take their money out. His first fireside chat is explaining to people why they should not put their money in their mattresses as they were, and why they should leave it in their banks. Imagine coming into president that way. He faced a world of rapidly expanding fascist power. You think ISIS and the Taliban is bad. Just remember what you know about the Nazis and the Japanese in this period, and the Italians and others in this period. And Franklin Roosevelt faced all these challenges with an office so small, those of us in this room lose sight of how different it was from what the presidency looks like today. He had a staff of less than 10 people. Many of you in this room have staffs larger than Franklin Roosevelt did. My favorite factoid about Franklin Roosevelt, his salary was so low as president that he was the last president to still collect an allowance from his mother. And those of you still in college know the experience, right? And as you experienced when you were still in college, his mother, even when he was president, used to write him and ask him how he had spent his money. He had to report to her on how he spent his money. Executive authority over the Constitution, over daily activities was minimal. People did not expect the president to solve the economic problems. The reason they were angry at Hoover was not because he didn't have a solution, but because Hoover didn't seem to even be able to understand the problems, at least in the perception of American citizens. Hoover did understand the problems. People didn't think he did. But they did not believe that this man could solve those problems. They did not believe that it was the president's responsibility. They just wanted the president to do something. Expectations were low. But do not misconstrue the history. He was not elected to solve the Depression. He was elected to do something. Elected to do something, and that he did. And that he did. This man was elected president, of course, in 2008, during another enormous economic downturn. Not really on the scale of the Great Depression, but the closest we've come since the Great Depression, and what could spin out many stories where our economy teetered on the edge of collapse. Teetered on the edge of collapse. Imagine if there had not been, in the end, an effort to save the banking system. There was a point just before he came into office when the Federal Reserve reported that 12 out of the 13 largest banks in the United States were in jeopardy of failing. 12 of the 13 largest banks in the United States were in jeopardy of failing. What's actually most scary is that now our banks are even more consolidated than they were then. We've actually gone in the wrong direction. But that's another lecture. He came into office, and I love this image of him visiting India in 2012 because it captures so much about how our world has changed. An African-American president going to India. But it captures also the differences in the presidency today from the presidency in Franklin Roosevelt's time. First of all, Franklin Roosevelt did not travel around the world by airplane. Right? He went by ship. First president to really travel extensively by airplane was Dwight Eisenhower, right, internationally. So just the ability of the presidents to go to India in this way is quite extraordinary. Roosevelt travels, but he travels for wartime meetings with wartime leaders. He doesn't travel in the way that the president travels today. But even more than that, here's the important point in these images. Everywhere the president went, everything he did, everything he touched in India was covered in India as the most important news story. He's not only our president, he's a world figure in the way in which no American was of 2 generations ago. We might not pay attention when he's in India, but they paid attention. They paid attention to everything he did. And we underrate the power of the office if we forget about that. If we forget about its presence and the attention that it draws. That's also the challenge. That's also the challenge. Part of my lecture today is about how the growth of this office and the growth of power, whether held by Barack Obama or George Bush or Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush, that the growth of power in this office has created new challenges we have only begun to talk about. We are using the language of another time to talk about an office that looks very different. And therefore, we're having trouble understanding the problems we face today. The president now has a staff in the thousands, a budget unmatched by any other country in the world. And he is the single most important actor for the global economy. Right? Think about that green stuff you use called money, right? The only person in the world who can print it. The only person who can order it to be printed. Right? The president is the most important actor in the world economy. He's the most important education funder in the world. Majority of education funding comes now from the federal government. Almost none of it came in Franklin Roosevelt's time. Major source of research, the largest funder of basic research in the world is the executive branch of the federal government. Funded through the National Science Foundation, National Institute for Health, and if you include Department of Defense research, you have actually not just the largest source, you have a source that dwarfs all other sources of research. Right? That's why the Pentagon invented the internet. In fact, they invented almost everything we use because they put so much money into all kinds of research that they have their fingerprints on all of it, on all of the research that we use. We are, of course, the largest military, bar none, in the world, and our foreign policy has effects that are unmatched by others. Now, there are challengers. This is not to say that our power is unchallenged, but our challengers, as in China, Russia, and others, notice they challenge us in regional areas. We act globally. They act mostly regionally. I make this point because we throw out the terms globalization. What globalization really means is the spread of American power and influence, but in ways that don't always serve our interests. So it's not about globalization being good or bad. It's about our having a global presence that creates new challenges for us. Challenges of leadership and, most importantly, challenges of focus and strategy. Here is my basic point today, that we are doing too much. I'm not for smaller government and I'm not for bigger government. I'm for better government. And what's happened is our presidency and our government in general is doing too many things for too many people in too many places. And therefore, doing nothing very poorly but nothing very well. We are mediocrity across the line. We are mediocrity across the line, and we're poorly served by those who condemn our government and still collect their Social Security and Medicare checks. We're poorly served by those who argue that government's the solution and want to just keep adding responsibilities on. Neither is the right approach, and that's all we're hearing, is that debate. The reality is that we need new focus, new ways of thinking about leadership, new ways of understanding government in this new environment where we have so many challenges on a daily basis. And I'm going to talk about that today, how that happened. It wasn't a decision by any leader. It was a historical set of developments that we are experiencing now, but since we don't think historically, we don't understand or recognize. If we recognize these issues, we can do better. Let me put that another way. If we recognize these issues, and the people who are in office will get out of the way and let young people come into office, we can solve these problems. That's my argument for today. Thank you for cheering for that. I'm always testing the audience when I say that, because I know in this audience, These are the best, wise, experienced people in the world, I know. But not everyone is that way. This is, again, Minnesota, right? Franklin Roosevelt, what he did was to transform government. He created the modern presidency, and he was the last man to master it. He created it, and he mastered it. He created a whole new set of agencies. Agencies that redefined government. My favorite Franklin Roosevelt story is also a Ronald Reagan story. If you read Ronald Reagan's memoirs, you will very quickly find out that Franklin Roosevelt was his hero until about the 1960s. Why was Franklin Roosevelt Ronald Reagan's hero? Well, because Ronald Reagan's father, Jack Reagan, lost his job during the Depression. Right? Anyone remember what Ronald Reagan's father did as a profession? He was a shoe salesman. He was a heavy-drinking Irish immigrant shoe salesman. And Reagan's father lost his job because people stopped buying shoes and became a heavier drinker, had problems with Reagan's mother. This is a common phenomenon that happened during the Depression. Men lost their jobs, lost their status, developed other social issues associated with that. And as Reagan put it, Franklin Roosevelt saved my family. What did Franklin Roosevelt do? When he came into office, he created a whole set of agencies, so-called alphabet agencies. Civilian Conservation Corps, Agricultural Adjustment Act, National Recovery Act, we can go on and on. Agencies that were sent out to provide people who had lost their jobs with an opportunity to be employed and contribute something to society. Jack Reagan was hired as a community organizer by Franklin Roosevelt. So you could argue that we've had actually two community organizers as president. Ronald Reagan is his father, really, and Barack Obama. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but this is the truth. And this is in Reagan's words, not mine. His father found an anchor in society because of the New Deal. That's what Franklin Roosevelt did. What was the New Deal? It was the federal government stepping in where it hadn't stepped before and saying it is going to get involved in the economy and it is going to provide people with jobs so they can contribute. No handouts, but an opportunity to work. So the best model is the Civilian Conservation Corps, where young, unemployed people, unemployment rate among youth was about 50%. Young, unemployed people were given jobs building paths through national parks, building roads, building schools. My kids go to a public school in Austin, Texas that was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Look around, many of the schools and public buildings were built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Roosevelt created the ability for that. He used the presidency to put people to work and allow them to contribute to society. He did the same thing during World War II. His message during World War II, if you go and listen, and I encourage you all to do this, you can listen on the web. I have to say this, not now, when you leave the room. You can listen on the web. This audience doesn't have to worry about this. With undergraduates, I do. You can listen to Roosevelt's fireside chats. And I play them for young people today, and they're still drawn in by him. They're still drawn in by his talk about creating jobs, and during World War II, his talk about public service. He asked men and women to serve their country against a foreign evil. This is famous quarantine argument, that there's a disease in the world, and we must band together to quarantine and fight that disease. The disease was fascism, of course. He called on people to do that. You'll note he never promises victory. He promises sacrifice for a higher purpose. And he made the president the vestibule for that, an inspirer for that. He brought people together. Countless oral histories you've probably heard family members say this, that they came out of depression and fear of foreign conflict, and Roosevelt was the president who made them to believe that America could come through. They saw him as a father figure. He made the presidency into this father figure role. Now, Obama has not been able to do that. He has not been able to do that. And one of the historical questions is why? Why was he so structurally limited when he, in fact, came into office intending to do exactly that? He spent his first months in transition reading all about Roosevelt, reading about just what I said. So there's nothing I've said he did not know. Everything I've said, he knew. Why did he have so much trouble? Why was he unable to do this? Well, I think the problem has to do with what he inherited. It's in fact Roosevelt's successes and the continued building on those successes which has made it so hard for him. Let me give you some examples. I'll come back to George Washington a little later.
Here we have the Executive Office Building in Washington, D.C. How many people have seen this building? Right, good. You can see the White House just to my left there. It's actually see the white building there? That's actually the Oval Office. So the NSC, the National Security Council, is on the left side of the Executive Office Building. The National Security Advisor can look into the Oval Office to see who's meeting with the President, which foreign leader, et cetera, et cetera. This building, which was built in the late 19th century, this building initially housed the War Department, the Navy, and the State Department. It was built in the late 19th century to house pretty much all of the government. Now, students often ask me where the Air Force was. There was no Air Force in the late 19th century. No Air Force. And war was Army and Navy. They were separate. This building, constructed to house, in essence, the entire government, by 1943, housed just the staff of the President. And now, this building does not even cover the entire staff of the American President. State has its own facility. Everyone knows where Army and Navy are, right? What is still, I think, the largest office building in the world, and what I believe is now the second largest employer in the world. There is someone who's actually superseded the Pentagon as a larger employer. It's called Walmart. So it goes Walmart and then the Pentagon. This is a good point for everyone, right? You don't want to be on that list. Right? That's not a good list to be on, right? This building, actually constructed during World War II, houses a permanent American military establishment that the Founding Fathers could not imagine. You all know your Constitution, right? The Army is supposed to be called up by draft in time of emergency. The United States is to have a small Army, and in fact, in the Constitution, the Army and the Navy are separated, and it's a War Department and Navy Department, so they're not unified. The framers were very wise and understood that a unified military establishment is not often a good thing for civilian democracy. We've gone, because of World War II and Cold War pressures, for good reasons, we have developed a permanent military establishment, unprecedented in size in our history, post-45. And we've developed a government bureaucracy that's much of Washington, D.C., unprecedented, unfathomable to the Founding Fathers. Now, this was all done not because anyone said it was ideologically good, but as a response to the problems of the modern world. The President needs this kind of staff. We need this kind of group to manage our nuclear weapons, right? Everyone understand that we couldn't just draft people, right, to manage the nuclear weapons, right? So these are reactions to the reality of the world that we live in, but that's where we historically have to think about these issues. Because this is not the world that this man lived in at all, right? The Founding Fathers, their most creative act was the act of creating the presidency. Congress, as it exists, reflects the history of other parliamentary systems. They were not original in coming up with the idea of a legislature or bicameral legislature. And they were not original in the way they thought about the Supreme Court. In fact, the Supreme Court as we know it, and the use of judicial review, is a 19th century phenomenon, right? Created in Marbury versus Madison, not in the Constitution. The uniqueness of the Constitution was this office. And what did the framers think that the President of the United States should do? Well, he should be a person directly elected by the people, representative of the people, with certain limited monarchical powers. That's the way to think of the President. A Republican monarch, Republican lowercase r, which is to say someone from a republic with monarchical powers. The ability to represent the people as a whole, as a prime minister doesn't. The ability to pardon people. You ever notice the President has the pardoning power? Right? No prime minister can pardon people. Every president. Obama will do this when he leaves office. There will be people he will pardon. People who are on death row, who he doesn't want to see on death row, he'll pardon them. You might pardon some donors also. That usually happens as well. Everyone does this. Part of my lecture is to say the Democrat and Republican arguments we're having are not really the real arguments to have. There's more continuity than there is difference. He's commander-in-chief. He embodies the nation as a whole. He can speak for the people. He's the only office in our country elected by everyone. Elected by everyone who can vote and chooses to vote. But he's still limited by law, limited by the legislature, and limited by a recurring cycle and set of institutions that constrain, most importantly, his money. Right? That's the real reason why this man had a small salary and a small staff because Congress jealously guarded the money they gave the president. Right? He had to beg to get more of a staff because they wanted to maintain their control over him. Okay, so that's the initial presidency. The real role the president plays is as a unifying figure. As a unifying figure for the country. He is to be the person who brings Americans together. Everyone see why this would be important in the late 18th century? When most people thought of themselves as citizens of Massachusetts or Virginia, not as Americans. Everyone recognized that. People didn't go around in 1789 saying they're American. They said, I'm from Massachusetts, and I'm from Virginia. And in fact, they had trouble understanding each other. I still have trouble understanding some people in Texas, but we're getting there. We're making progress. Okay, the second stage in the development of the modern presidency is this. Can everyone see Lincoln here? Everyone can see the great man? Right there? Barely. The wonderful thing about Lincoln's presidency, there he is that he's 6'6", so he stands out. But also, this is the first era of photography. Right? This is really the first era of photography being used in a mass and repeated way, giving us these images from the Civil War, many of which you've seen. Lincoln takes this presidency one step further. It's not a unique thing for me to say at all. Lincoln uses the presidency not only to unify the country, but to rebuild the country. That's really what the Civil War is. That's really what the Civil War is. It is a redefinition, a rebuilding of American society. Do not get this history wrong. America, in the 19th century, oversees, the government does, Lincoln does, the single largest reappropriation of personal property in the world at the time, which is the freeing of slaves. Slaves go from being property to being free citizens. We are slow to do that. Other societies have done that before us, except for Cuba and Brazil. But when we do it faster and in a more extreme way than other societies. That doesn't mean that we go to equality. We are far from it in the 19th century, just as we really are today as well. But what Lincoln does is he uses the presidency to redefine citizenship. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are about that. And to redefine the government, the federal government, as the most powerful entity that will rebuild the nation. It's not just the war. It's all the other stuff that goes along with it. The creation of the Intercontinental Railroad. 1869. The Homestead Act. People in Minnesota know the Homestead Act, right? You benefit from the Homestead Act, right? Providing land. Get this, you didn't even have to be a citizen. You could claim the right to a land scrip so long as you proved that you would work the land. This is core Republican principles. He's the first Republican large R president, right? It's about free labor. You work freely, no slavery. Free soil, access to land. Free soil, free labor, free men. Free soil, free labor, free men. The Homestead Act is the federal government changing our territory, encouraging people to work the land to become a more productive, integrated economy using the railroad. I have to remind students that the railroad was actually once important in American society, right? People actually took trains, right? Trains were the main means of transportation. It's why Minneapolis exists, right? Everyone recognizes that? Railroad hub. If they put the railroad somewhere else, I don't know where they would have done it in Minnesota, but if they put it somewhere else, Minneapolis would not exist. Chicago was the same thing, right? Observers at the time called Chicago the smelliest city in the world. Why? Because there were more pigs, quite literally, brought in from more parts of the United States than in any other society, brought to Chicago and slaughtered, and that's why we have pepperoni pizza. You never thought about that, did you? Pizza comes to the United States without pepperoni on it. It is the surplus of pig that leads Americans to put the pepperoni on the pizza. See? When you eat pizza now, you can think historically coming out of this. The Moral Land Grant. This is my favorite Lincoln Act. The Moral Land Grant. You have a great university in the city, University of Minnesota. It is a land grant university. 1862, Lincoln and Congress pass legislation that is designed to make higher education accessible for poor farmers. The creation of public universities. There are very few things actually Americans did that no one else did. That's one of them. No other society said they were going to take federal money through land and create universities so poor immigrant farmers in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Germans and Swedes, could go to university. And they weren't in other societies till the 20th century, right? That is what the federal government was doing. Right? Everyone knows how the land grants work. The federal government gave land to the states. And the states then sold the land. They had to, and used the money from the sales of the land to found universities. So the University of Minnesota is not on the land that Lincoln gave the state. Lincoln gave the state other land that the state sold, and it used that money to endow its university, and then the state provided the land that the university sits on. Right now, that's how it worked. Federal project. Federal project. Unthinkable for this man. Basic politics now. Presidentially led. Next time you step on the University of Minnesota campus, please think about that and remind everyone about that too. What changes in this world? What changes in this world is that we enter a third stage. If Washington is about unifying the country and providing some sense of national purpose, and Lincoln is about building the country, making us into a modern, industrial type, into the world power that we become, the story of the second half of the 20th century is about a story of what historians call the administrative state. The presidency taking on now a role of management and policy detail with extensive reach that has gone beyond developing, but now managing things at a level that was unthinkable before. In a sense, bringing order to an increasingly complex world. Bringing order to an increasingly complex world. Let me give you a couple of examples of things we take for granted that after 1945 people in these buildings start doing, that this man would have found unthinkable, and this man couldn't have even imagined. Let's talk about some of those, and it's actually a nearly endless list. The United States, after 1945, rebuilds Germany and Japan. The Marshall Plan provides $30 billion. That is almost $1 trillion today, actually, of money to the societies we were fighting against for a generation that came out of depression and World War to rebuild those societies out of self-interest. But that's being managed by these buildings. And the money is being put toward that. Unthinkable. Unthinkable. We actually invest more in reconstructing Germany and Japan proportionally, as well as in absolute terms, than we did in reconstructing the South after the Civil War. Now, the Germans got a better deal in a certain way than the Georgians did. And the Georgians won't let us forget that, probably. Second, again, we could go on and on. The federal government now is the largest provider of health care in the world. You never thought about that, right? You never thought about that. There are other societies that have single-payer systems, right? We don't have a single-payer system, but we in fact do have a single-payer system, right? Who pays for Medicare? Who covers the health insurance for the military? Who does Medicaid? We don't have a single-payer system because we don't let everyone have access to it. When it comes down to it, the government is actually doing it. And here's a really interesting phenomenon. We bail out all those who can't do it themselves. So in 2008, when AIG almost went out of business, everyone remember that? The insurance company? Who bought AIG? George W. Bush. The federal government. So in fact, the federal government owned more life insurance policies in the Philippines than anyone else did through AIG. We are managing the world economy and we're managing the health of our citizens, even though we don't have a national health policy. Right? Because the truth is, no one wants to let unhealthy people go untreated. And in the end, when no one treats them, you know who does. You know who pays the bill. You and I do through the federal government, right? You and I do through the federal government. The federal government is responsible for law enforcement, not just at home, but around the world. Why is it that there's very little piracy in the world? Why is it that you can travel by plane or by ship most places, and your plane or ship will get there? Is it because people are benevolent? Or is it because the United States government manages the commons? Manages the commons. You and I are paying, and our federal government every day, and the president is doing this, is making sure that the commons, the seas and the air, are generally safe for our travel. It is our Air Force and our Navy and our legal structure that do that, even around China. Even around China. Unthinkable for Lincoln. Unthinkable for George Washington. And then we could go beyond that. We are the largest aid provider in the world. We probably don't do enough, but we provide more money than any other society. Smaller proportion of our GNP, because our GNP is so large, but a larger proportion, larger total amount than anyone else. And we are the global police and fire department, right? When there's a genocide, or a tsunami, or an earthquake, like the horrible earthquake that just occurred in Nepal, people generally don't ask the Chinese to come in. Who do they look to? Right? Since 1945, it's been us. We've played that role. Now, I'm not arguing that we are saints. We are not. In fact, we've done this because we have seen a self-interest in it. Everything I laid out that we do because we think it benefits us, and it does. We live a particular lifestyle because of this. We assume a certain degree of safety. We assume that we have access to goods that we wouldn't have access to otherwise, right? So we benefit from this. We disproportionately benefit from this. But it is an enormous responsibility that we have taken on. And if you forget nothing else, if you remember nothing else, remember this, that it has become, for President Obama, not just more than Roosevelt did, it is a different world from Roosevelt. That's the key issue. In spite of the challenges, which were grave for the Great Depression and World War II, it was still a manageable world. The set of responsibilities on Roosevelt's desk were a set of responsibilities that he could think through and deal with and prioritize. It has become almost impossible for a president to do that today. And that is not about the quality of the individual. It's about the responsibility of the office, and it's about the structure of our society and what we expect from government, but not just what we expect, ladies and gentlemen, what the world expects, the pressure that the world puts on the president. I want to give you some examples of this. One of the great things about being a historian, why you should all be historians, and it's never too late, is you get to read other people's mail. I mean, the NSA gets to do that now. You get to do it legally as a historian. We go into original materials. And so I want to show you some of the original materials I've been working with, and my students as well, to understand these issues. We've been looking at calendars. We have every day of every president's life documented from Franklin Roosevelt to the present. So we can look at what they did. It's actually a wonderful test case. I do a lot of lecturing to CEOs on leadership, and they look at these calendars and say, oh my gosh, this is our world too, right? If you want to know what people value, look what they give time to. Time is the most valuable resource that powerful people have. So where they put the time is where they put their priorities. So here is Franklin Roosevelt's calendar. You can all see it. From the day after the Pearl Harbor attack. It's a pretty reasonable calendar, isn't it? Kind of looks like what I remember my dad's calendar. Looking like a little daytimers thing. If you know your Roosevelt history, this is Missy LeHand, his secretary, who writes things in. Here's the speech to Congress, you've all heard, declaring war. The Empire of Japan. This day shall live in infamy. The Empire of Japan has attacked us. Right? There it is. I love this part of it here. He meets with Mayor LaGuardia from New York City. Right? Not because LaGuardia has any role in war planning, but because LaGuardia is a very popular politician. He wants to talk to LaGuardia about how to talk about the war with the American public. A pretty smart thing to do. But look how free his calendar is. Something that isn't working is that he's able to manage his time and manage the issues. Right? He's able to manage his time and manage the issues. Let's just flash forward a little bit here. Here is John F. Kennedy. This is when the world begins to change. And this is a really important date, October 16th, 1962. This is the day John F. Kennedy is briefed by the intelligence agencies, by the CIA in particular, about the missiles, the Soviet missiles in Cuba. The U-2 aircraft has flown over Cuba on October 14th. It has taken photos. I tell people now, your phone has almost as much power as the U-2 cameras did in 1962. It's pretty amazing, actually. What they literally would do, students can't believe it, they would just fly over the stuff and take pictures, right? So the pictures are brought back to Washington and analyzed, and here you have it. This is the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis here, when the president is briefed by the vice president, well, the vice president sitting there, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Chairman of JCS, Maxwell Taylor, Roswell Gilpatrick, who is his Undersecretary of Defense, and Martin, who is the Undersecretary of State for Latin American Affairs. And he has a follow-up meeting here. But notice all the other things he has to do. He's meeting with the King of Libya. He's got all these other things, but it's still relatively manageable, right? Then we get to Lyndon Johnson. This is one of like 12 pages for one day for Lyndon Johnson. Right? This is just from starting in the morning. And this is an interesting day. This is the day, March 8th, 1965, the day that the first American combat forces land in Vietnam. Da Nang. It's the beginning of the Vietnam War. Taking these sort of beginning moments of important conflicts, right? And he's dealing with so many issues. Look at how much else is on his plate here. Press conference, Latin American issues, campaign contributions. He's got so many other things he's dealing with. Let's go forward again. Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford. This is May 13th, 1975. This is the day that the Mayaguez, the American ship, how many people remember the Mayaguez? Right? No one remembers the Mayaguez, right? A few people remember the Mayaguez, right? It's an American ship seized by the Cambodians. And there's a real crisis about getting the ship back. We actually send Marines in. People forget this. And threaten a larger scale military operation. This is just after we've withdrawn from Vietnam. Right? People say, we've never had a case where we've left a region and then been called right back in as we are with ISIS today. Say, no, that happens every time. It happens every time. It's what happened here. And they have to deal with getting the ship and the crew back that have been taken hostage. And they do. It's actually a great success for Ford. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that if people want. Notice he starts at 2 a.m. And notice how his day goes on. Notice how his day goes on. Ronald Reagan's interesting, by the way. His calendar is less on it. In fact, Ronald Reagan's calendar looks more like Franklin Roosevelt's, which is interesting in certain ways. This is the day the Marine barracks in Beirut is bombed in 1983. Right? Everyone remembers that day. I remember as a little kid. I remember that 241 Americans died on that day. Some have argued that's the beginning of the contemporary problems in the Middle East. That was the first time most people heard of Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad. And it was the first major terrorist operation that was not an airplane hijacking against American forces in the Middle East. Really the beginnings of the world. And Reagan, of course, has to deal with this, but his day keeps his day relatively free. Why do I show you this? I think there are a number of observations that we should make. It is a different world from this. And I think the orthography of the calendars, the way they're constructed, tells us something. Tells us something. The president was not trying to manage the world. He was trying to deal with a few big issues. Right? There were crises, but it was generally supposed to be an office that was not managing every detail, focused on a few issues. And the issues grow, and they grow, and the demands on the president grow. And these calendars, ladies and gentlemen, I've given you particular snapshots, but they go on day after day after day after day. And so what you see is more and more, especially in the middle of the Cold War, more and more meetings per day. Anybody imagine if you really had average 10, 11 meetings a day on these kinds of weighty issues? And I mean, Lyndon Johnson really stands out. But you just look at how much harder presidents are working. So it's not that our presidents are not working hard. They're in fact working harder than they ever worked. And it's not that they aren't smart. They actually probably are smarter than they've ever been in terms of their grasp of technical details, right? Harry Truman never took a physics course, never went to college, and he had to make decisions about atomic weapons. I'm quite certain he never actually understood nuclear fission. I'm not sure I understand it, but I understand it better than he understood it. Right? And every president after that had a better understanding. Most presidents probably have a better understanding how the economy operates. Most have actually taken an economics course, have spent time observing these issues. So our presidents are getting smarter, they're working harder, but they're getting less done. They're getting smarter, working harder, we're getting less done. Does that sound familiar? They're having more shorter meetings. More shorter meetings. So here's a hypothesis that I put out there. That if you're having lots of short meetings, you're putting band-aids on problems, you're not solving problems. Right? Notice in these calendars, notice that FDR has lots of time. How did FDR make decisions? He made decisions the way human beings make decisions, right? He called people in at 4 o'clock, mixed some drinks. He called it the children's hour. He mixed these drinks, they were horrible drinks. But if the president gives you a drink, you drink it. He would call people together. He would draw them out in conversation. He'd listen to their thoughts on issues. Important people who knew things about issues that mattered to him. Then they'd leave, and then he'd make a decision. And then he would tell them all that they influenced his decision, even if they did or they didn't. But he deliberated, he thought, he dealt with the big issues. There's less and less time for that. In a world where you are rushing from issue to issue, you don't have time for that. Since 1971, the President has begun his day nearly every day by a 24-year-old briefer, who was my student for a while, who will go into the President's bedroom and tell the President all the bad things that happened in the world while he was asleep. That's how he begins his day. How would you like to begin your day? That way. Where is the space or the inspiration for creativity? Presidents spend most of their days, and this is what the calendars show, running to catch up and react to problems that they did not make, that they really don't care about, but that they have to care about because they're the President of the United States. They are running after their tails. And in fact, the weaker international actors are setting their agenda. We've all lived through this in the last 11 years, 11, 12 years now, 13 years now. We've all lived through this, right? Who set our agenda? Who set our foreign policy in the last 13 years? Did we set it or did Al-Qaeda set our foreign policy? Who really influenced what we've done, how we've spent our money? Look how we've spent our money. Look how our rhetoric has changed. Look how our domestic laws have changed. Look how you get felt up at the airport now. All these things, all these changes are reactions to someone else. I'm not arguing you don't react, but I'm arguing when the reaction defines you, you are not defining the environment you're in and you're underperforming. We are so large and we are so touched by so many things that we let the smaller actors define us. And we react to them in these short meetings. Notice the one standout are the longer meetings that Roosevelt is able to make time for. A 60-minute plus meeting. My hypothesis is you don't actually make a real decision on something that's important if you have to spend an hour really talking about it. You don't in 15 minutes solve the problems in the Middle East or Russia or anything like that. You put Band-Aids on them. You put Band-Aids on them. The tendency of our policy over the last 40 years has not been about Republican or Democratic ideology dominating what is done. It has been about a very powerful country using a wide array of short-term Band-Aids and tactical solutions to big strategic problems. We are constantly just doing little bits of things rather than big things that make a big difference. It is the fundamental absence of creativity in our policy. It is the fundamental continuity in our policy. Here is how it normally works. You're seeing this right here with John F. Kennedy. A foreign leader comes, not a Democrat. Here is the leader of Libya. Asks for money. Everyone asks for money. If you've ever run an organization, everyone comes to your office to ask for money. They always want your money. Even if you don't have money, they still want your money. I feel that way as a parent, but young kids too. It's always about money. They come and ask you for money. The easiest thing to do, if you're the United States, is give them a little bit. Right? You give them a little bit, as Kennedy does after this meeting. And then you give them a little bit, and then they come back and ask for more. Well, you've invested now, so you give them a little more. And then bad things happen. But you've invested in this, and your name is on it, so now you then send troops to help deal with the problems that happened. And then very soon you're following that with another issue and another. And in fact, you're doing that, and so you have fewer resources and less time to deal with the other problems. It's not about too much government or too little, it's about undisciplined government. It's not about too much or too little, it's about tactics instead of strategy. What we have done since Roosevelt, ladies and gentlemen, is we have elected, and you see this in the calendars, enormously talented, tactical people. People who can come up with ways of making every problem look like it's getting better. People who are able to give us one sentence about every issue we ask them about. Tactical abilities, but not the discipline to do what strategy is all about. What is strategy? Three things. The three things we're not doing. One, defining priorities. You define priorities by what you don't do, not by what you do. If you're doing everything, you're not prioritizing. Franklin Roosevelt was ruthless about that. Many people from my background, I'm partially Jewish, criticized Roosevelt appropriately for not stopping the Holocaust. Roosevelt knew the Holocaust was occurring, and he did not make that a priority, but he said very clearly that was not the priority in the United States. The priority of the U.S. government was to defeat the fascists. And if any aircraft was not used to bomb a fascist military position, it was a wasted resource. So he did not bomb the camps. He did not bomb the camps, and it was not an anti-Semitic decision. It was easier to do this because he cared a little less about Jews, but it was not because he was anti-Semitic. It was because that was not his priority. Part of being a world leader is saying there are bad things that are going to happen that will not be our priorities, and there are things that are our priorities that we must focus upon. We are not doing that. Second, there is a fundamental absence of creativity. Strategy involves creativity. When was the last time you heard someone talk about a creative national policy? Can you even understand the Affordable Care Act? I think I support it, but I'm not really sure. And I've tried to read it. I really have. It's my job. I have a PhD and I still can't understand it. Right? We make things so complex and they're so absent of creativity that we underperform. Strategy involves creativity. The best leaders are creative. And third, we are, unfortunately, obsessed with what economists call sunk costs. Which is to say, a sunk cost is something we put a lot into, it's not working, but because we put a lot into it, we feel we have to continue to put a lot into it. Another way of saying that is, we never give up on commitments we made in the past. I was part of a study, a group of scholars, we've done a study of this. It's actually almost impossible to find any foreign commitment the United States has made since 1945 that it has said, okay, the commitment's now over. We in fact just keep adding commitments on. We just add more on. And it's not our fault, really, because those we have committed to keep asking us to keep our commitments. In fact, we would be better off if they didn't like us as much. They say they don't like us, but they want us there. Everyone notice that? Right? They want us there, even though they say they don't like us, right? Because we provide them security. We provide them resources. The American soldiers in Germany, by the way, are a major source of economic stimulation for the southwest German economy. If you go to Rhineland-Pfalz, you can't walk a few blocks without falling over American soldiers who were there. They're an integral part of that part of society. So these commitments just build on each other. To be strategic is not only to set priorities and to be creative. To be strategic is to recognize that your commitments are time-dependent. Your commitments are time-dependent. We have lost the ability to move ourselves away from time-dependent commitments, and therefore are pulled in too many directions abroad as well as at home. And I say this, I've seen this at a university too. It's much easier to create a department or a program than to end a department or a program, right? You just keep adding and adding on. This manifests itself not only in their calendars, in so many other elements of presidential behavior. Just another side note, even when you get a president like Ronald Reagan, who looks like he's not as hard a worker, he really is. This is where historical research is important. What you see is not always exactly what's going on. Reagan, in fact, worked twice as hard as Truman, even though he wasn't the hardest working president. In fact, intended to work less hard. Just an example of these phenomena. This is an interesting thing we've done. We've looked at who presidents meet with, who they spend most of their time with. And you'd be surprised. They actually spend very little time with foreign diplomats in general, and very little time with members of Congress. So let me actually disabuse you of one false thing that's said all the time. Obama has met no less with the opposition in Congress than his predecessors. Most presidents almost never meet with the other side in Congress. It's a misnomer. It's a misnomer. He's met with them about the same proportion as others have. He hasn't met with them more. He hasn't been more bipartisan. He hasn't been less bipartisan. Most presidents don't spend a lot of time with Congress. They don't spend a lot of time with foreign leaders. They spend a lot of time with these kinds of people. You might remember from Reagan's years. Staff. Staff. Meeks was Reagan's chief of staff in California, brought him to the White House, later became Attorney General. Michael Deaver, remember Michael Deaver? He was the Karl Rove or David Axelrod of Ronald Reagan. He was the campaign guy. And Jimmy Baker, he was the chief of staff, later Secretary of Treasury, later Bush's Secretary of State. What you see in those meetings is these figures, these kinds of figures dominate the president's time. And what happens? They're good people. These are hardworking, really, really smart people on both sides of the aisle. But what happens is they're staff and they chop the issues up. So the issues are dealt with as discrete problems, not as integrated issues. We are chopping up our problems rather than integrating them. So we've got something to react to with ISIS, then something to react to with Iran, something to react to with North Korea. We don't have a discussion about how all these things fit together, because staff are charged to look at specific things. There's a staff member for North Korea. There's a staff member for China. Those staff members cut the issues up, and the president deals with them in a cut-up way. And there's remarkably little interaction between this man, as president, and someone who's not on his staff. Even when he travels, that's why I put this up. And this is something that gets worse with every administration. For security reasons and for administrative reasons, every successive president travels with more people. So much so now that Air Force One is one of 3 planes that go with the president. You all realize that? And everywhere he goes, it's multiple vehicles. In fact, his staff hates when he travels because they all have to go with him. They're away from their families. He is living in a true bubble. He was just in Austin a few months ago. They closed half the university for him. They pull up his entourage right next to the building. He comes out, gives his speech, shakes a few hands, gets back in, and then goes back on his plane. Everything is controlled. Everything is scripted. Everyone he meets has been vetted. Every occasion is non-spontaneous. That's the big point here. If you compare that world I've just described to this world, I think you see greater spontaneity here. I think you see greater touch. Here is a president who cannot walk, but yet his schedule and his daily life allows him to interact and meet with people in a way that's more informal, in a way that's more spontaneous, in a way that's more reactive to the world than what we see with presidents today. And that's a structural change in our society. So where do we go from here? We can't go back to this world, and I'm not saying we should. That's not going to be effective. We can't go back to that world. Where do we go from here? These are the last few things I will say, because diagnosing the problem is much easier than prescribing a solution. And I welcome your suggestions, because I'm finishing a book on this where I promised to have some solutions, and I'm stuck, because the solutions are really hard. But that's why I think I'm right. These are historical challenges we face that will be the same whether it's Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton or whoever it is who's president. One thing we have to think more about is how do we train ourselves as a society to elect people and incentivize strategic thinking rather than tactical thinking. Our politics have gone in the almost entirely tactical direction, wherein we are encouraging candidates and leaders to do something for every single group, rather than something that's actually bigger and in the national interest. How do we train ourselves to incentivize strategic thinking? And that involves, it seems to me, allowing a toleration for failure. Another point. All the literature on strategy says that you cannot be strategic if you don't take certain reasonable risks, which involve failure. Every successful businessman I've talked to has told me he or she failed many times before he or she succeeded, right? Most of us as scholars have had more failed projects than successful ones. Let me tell you, we only talk about the successful ones, but if you want to hear about the failed ones, I'll lecture all day for you if you want, right? You can only succeed if you fail and acknowledge failure. How do we build that into our system? Right now, the word failure cannot be used by a president, right? For obvious reasons. We won't even want to acknowledge it. How could the United States fail? We have failed many times. We're a great country. We have failed many times, and we need to start acknowledging that. How do we train ourselves also to do less and do more by doing less? And I think this is a broader cultural phenomenon, even than politics. We are a society, I see this with my students, where we are encouraging everyone to do more with less, rather than do less to accomplish more, right? And the truth is that if you try to do more with less, you actually are going to decline in the quality of what you do. So I think the best outcome from this discussion can be a serious outcome, a serious discussion of the ways in which a more limited presidency, a more focused presidency, or a more focused set of political discussions could be more valuable for our country. John F. Kennedy famously said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." I want to rephrase that today. I want to say, ask not how your country can solve every problem, because it can't. We're the strongest, best society in the world, but there are more problems we can't solve than the problems we can. Ask instead how the most important problems are the problems we can address. If we ask ourselves that, we can do better. Our election should not be about who pleases us most. It should instead be about what are the 2 or 3 biggest issues that we as a society care about, and which candidates are best suited to those 2 or 3 issues. Not to every possible issue, not to our little particular provincial interest, but to the big national issues. We need a debate, and all of you can encourage a debate about the big issues in our society. What do we stand for? How are we going to provide opportunity with clear evidence that opportunities close off to so many people in our society? How can we stimulate innovation in a society that seems to have trouble doing that in many areas? And most importantly, how can we create new hope for those who seem to be without hope? Those seem to me to be the questions we should be asking, but you could have your own. But they should be big questions, and they should be questions that we should not only ask our candidates, we should focus our young people on. This is the last thing I'll say. Too many of my students agree with these sorts of arguments when they see them historically, but then come to me and say, you know, we can't do anything about it. We're stuck in this world. We're stuck. We can't go back to this world. We're stuck. We're stuck with this. So let's just do the best we can and make enough money for ourselves and help ourselves. We as adults need to tell young people that's not good enough. We need them to do better than we've done. We need them to say they can change us. These are historical phenomena that will not be solved by an individual, but they will be solved by generations. And we need a new generation of leaders who are willing to take on these challenges, and we need them sooner rather than later. Thank you. So Ruth is going to manage the questions here. I'm happy to answer all of your questions and comments. Just put up your hand, Ruth. Thank you. What's your name? Deborah. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. I was the one who clapped.
Thank you.
For getting the new generation.
A+ for you, Deborah.
Thank you. In my senior year. But my question is how? Because it seems to me like we just keep seeing the same people, the same type of people, and it's all connected to money.
Absolutely.
What do we do in our period of life to support these young people and get them to do more of what I think they're probably better able to do?
I think that is the big question. I'm glad you asked that. And it's not easy. It's getting worse because there's more money in politics. We see the evidence of this. You know, we have the oldest Congress ever. The average age in Congress is above 65. The Republican and Democratic leaders in the Senate are both above 80. And nothing against people above 80, but this is not what we should want to see, right? Reid and McConnell, in fact, my students think they're the same person. They look alike, even. My students, right? They're fighting, but they look alike, right? So there are 3 things I think we can all do. But I want to say this is a long-term project. It's not going to change overnight, right? 1, we can all find young people of talent and mentor them. It's not just money. What is it that gets someone into a position to take risks and make a big difference? Having people with experience who help them along. And everyone in this room can mentor people. You all have life experience. You're all successful. Find people within your family and outside of your family who you can mentor, and especially in your local governments and local communities. Because as close as it is to the national system, at the local level it's still pretty open. Many local county seats are uncontested. Get people involved. Help them. Mentor them. 1. 2, think about where you put your money. Do you really want to put your money in the places you're putting it? Everyone in this room makes contributions. They're small in comparison to the Koch brothers. But what Obama did prove is you can get a lot of small contributions and make a difference, right? You get elected at least, right? Think about where you give your money. My wife is a philanthropic investor and advisor, and what she finds is a lot of the people she works for give their money to things because they've always given it to them, even though it doesn't match what they care about. Think about where you give your money. And then the third thing, most important thing, don't tolerate the bad behavior we see. Call people out. Shame them. Don't just sit there. Call people out. You are respected people in your communities. Be a model. And part of being a model is saying you're not going to accept when someone else behaves in a way that is selfish and hurting our system. Those three kinds of behavior are not going to change things overnight, Deborah, but I think they'll get things moving in the right direction, and I think they can inspire young people. I hope so. Yes. What's your name, sir?
Bob.
Bob. Thank you, Bob.
Whether it's Barack Obama or Franklin Roosevelt, who or what sets a president's agenda?
So, great question, Bob. Presidents think they set their agenda, but they don't. Two things set the agenda. The crisis of the moment, because we're in perpetual crisis mode, and that is related to the media, obviously, but I don't think we can blame the media alone. And then the staff, because the staff are the ones who are setting up the president's time. So presidents come into office thinking they have agenda A, and they find themselves pursuing agenda B and C, based on the international system and the crisis of the moment, and based on their staff.
No, thank you. My name is Greg. Going back to your obsession with sunk costs,
Yes.
I related to military projects where in order to get a military project through, they have to divide it up among every congressional district in the country.
Yes.
Is it the same issue with foreign money, foreign aid, or ultimately, or because it's still going to be using food produced in various parts of the country, and then you try to pull it, and somebody says, no, you can't stop all these jobs.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's worse with defense, because as you said so correctly, the defense contractors have been smart about putting their projects in every congressional district. Not every district produces food, but our food aid is key, especially the districts in this area. And one of the things that other countries complain about all the time is we run around saying, free trade, free trade, free trade. But we don't really have free trade because we subsidize agricultural exports to such an extent that we undercut others in the market. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but I'm saying we have to think about the implications of that. The big sunk cost problem is, whether it's foreign aid or military affairs, it is easier in our society today to send more money down a toilet hole or to send more soldiers to die than to actually say, no, I think we've done this wrong the last few years, and now we should do something different. And that's the real problem in our society.
My name is Paul, and I'd like to see if you can validate a perception I have. And I refer to that as the personalization of the presidency.
Yes.
And I'm going to use as an example, elect me and I will close Guantanamo. It strikes me, even though I think he should, that was one of the most ridiculous things he could say.
Yes.
Because it didn't recognize that it wasn't totally within his power to do so. So he set himself up for failure.
Yes.
My administration, my attorney general, my secretary, whatever. When one does that, one is telling the public, I have the power and the authority to do things, when in fact they don't. And therefore setting themselves up for failure, or the perception of failure.
Absolutely. I mean, the irony, Paul, and it's in your question so well, is that we have raised the expectations just as we've reduced our knowledge of what the constraints are. And so we're always disappointed in this way. And I encourage you again to listen to Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats. He never says I, he always says we. He always says we, and he says, here's how he defines his power. He says, I have the power to try something and create an agency, but he never promises what the agency is going to produce. He never says we're going to end poverty. That was Lyndon Johnson who said that, right? He never says, well, by the way, that we're going to defeat the fascists easily. He says we're going to fight for unconditional surrender. But he never says, I'm going to get this outcome. He says instead, we together are going to do this. And I think it is a personalization, and it's a way in which we make big demands, and then we want to just go on with our lives the way they are, right? So I think you're absolutely right. We need to understand the structure of politics more than just the individuals.
I'm not sure how to relate. Yesterday there was a story in the Warsaw Journal how there are special forces are being, small units, are being sent all over Asia, Africa, the Baltic Republic to train the people there so they will be able to fight extremists and we don't have to send our own people, big money, big military, and so forth. And I was also thinking about Kennedy's Peace Corps, and I wonder whether that's the way to get involved and not get involved, break when people need help, to send them small units and limit our big involvement.
Yeah, I think we've tried that for a long time, Hannah, and I mean, there are many worthy efforts through the Peace Corps and others, and also sometimes our military trainers are training local police forces and other things that do good. But we have to be very careful, because rarely does a small commitment like that end in that way. So I'm all for more aid. I'm all for more effective use of our professional military to encourage other militaries to be more professional and stay out of politics. But we have to be careful about how we're doing that, and we shouldn't just send our forces all over. We need to have a more coherent way of thinking about where our priorities are, and probably a fewer number of locations, and then more attention to the quality of what we're doing. Here's the scary thing. I don't think there's really anyone in the White House who knows where all of our stuff is, quite frankly. We're so big and so unwieldy. And again, that's not anyone's fault, but that's the structure of our society, and we need to start thinking about more focus. Again, not doing less, but being more focused in what we do.
Yes, hi, Professor. Thanks for your remarks. My name is John. You talked about, you've cataloged a number of sources of complexity in the president's job. In that context, can you give us a sense of where in this complicated formula the Washington influence industry comes in?
Yes, and I apologize that I didn't talk a lot about that. It's a big part of the book. I just, with the time in the presentation, I didn't talk about as much as I should. It obviously plays a huge influence. There are two kinds of Washington influence industries. One is the media, that people point to the 24-hour news cycle and the constant attention and desire for scandal and headlines. But the other is the set of established, powerful figures. Some of them are lobbyists, some of them are not. Some of them are retired generals. Some of them are former politicians, right? Bill Clinton's one of them, right? People who are connected, right, and are able to wield a lot of influence. Henry Kissinger, I wrote a whole book on, is one of these figures too. He can get a meeting with anyone he wants, and he can get his point of view across where you can't, John, right? So there are these seen and unseen influences, might be the way of talking about it. So military industry lobbyists, right, are able to define needs that might not actually be our needs in the military. But by the time it gets to the president, he's already been convinced that there are reasons why we need these weapon systems, even though they might not fit with his strategy as such. And we could talk about that in all kinds of other areas. So the best way to combat this is to be ruthlessly disciplined as a leader, not to let the media and these Washington insiders define your agenda, but to define your agenda and then use them to help you with your agenda, not the other way around.
We have just time for just two more questions.
Good afternoon, my name is Mary. I'm interested in your perspective about, we talked about the personalization of the presidency and presidents defining their agenda. I'm curious about your view about whether or not the electorate would ever accept a president who wasn't tactical and wasn't making promises about everything to everybody. It feels to me that in some ways, until the electorate changes their agenda or their expectations, a president can't do what you're suggesting. Do you have some comments or thoughts about how to change the electorate?
Well, no, Mary, I think you're 100% right in what you diagnosed, and I think we have to have open eyes and recognize that it's nice for us to come up with solutions, but we're a democratic society, and hopefully we'll always be a democratic society, so that's a real problem. And I don't think our electorate is worse now. I think this is a tendency, right? This is a problem with democracy, right? Everyone wants to vote for lower taxes, right? Everyone wants to vote to have better schools, but not pay for them, right? So this is a long-term problem. I think part of what we have to do is educate people, and we as educators need to do a better job. So I will say that. I want to take some ownership over this. And when we're not teaching these issues in our schools, that's a problem. When we have the football coach teaching history, that's contributing to this problem. No, I'm serious, right? If you're not teaching history, there's no way students can understand these issues. They need to learn science and math too. I'm not against that at all. But they better learn their history, otherwise they're not going to be ready to be citizens, right? And there are too many schools that cut history education or put the football coach in as the history teacher, right? So that's part of it. But the bigger issue is this. I think we missed the opportunity to do this, Mary, because we had a really big crisis, which provided an opening to do this, right? Generally, the electorate votes for what individuals want. But when there's a really big crisis, for a short time, people get focused. And we had two opportunities. 2001, late 2001, 2002, and 2008, 2009. And I firmly believe that in those two cases, if we had the kind of leadership we were talking about, and notice now I'm criticizing both a Republican and a Democrat, right? If we had either of those occasions, the kind of leadership that thought strategically, there was an opportunity for the president to say, I'm sorry, Americans, you cannot have all you want. These things matter more for us. Right? I think in early 2002, a president could have said, we need to be the most energy efficient society in the world, so we're not dependent on this oil and other stuff. Could have pushed that through. And I think in 2009, we could have had a president who could have said, the financial system is corrupt, too many people are not getting ahead, and a few people are getting really rich, and that's not the way it should be, and we're going to change it. I think both of those were opportunities that were missed because we had leaders who instead were tactical and trying to do too many things and were not focused enough. And then after a year, that window closed. My hypothesis is, I don't know what it'll be, in the next 4 to 5 years, we'll have another one of these windows. And this is the insight Bill Clinton had. He didn't do it. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. Because the one time you get the electorate focused is when you have a Pearl Harbor, or a September 11th, or a 2008 financial crash. Our next leader has to be ready to be strategic at that moment, not to be tactical, not to tell us to go shopping, right? Not to tell us the financial system is okay, right? Because it's not. So that's our opportunity. That's our moment. My dream is that we'd have, coming back to Deborah's point, a whole bunch of young leaders who would say this. Who knows if it'll happen? Yes.
My name is Bob.
Hi, Bob.
The Iran nuclear treaty deal
Yes.
is creating a lot of controversy right now, and the opposition says you can't trust the Iranians basically to hold up to their end of the negotiations. However, in the 50s, the Foster brothers deposed the democratically elected leader of Iran and
Right.
put in place a totalitarian regime by the Shah.
Right, the Dulles brothers.
John Foster Dulles.
John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles, yeah, sorry. That the Shah was deposed to create the theocracy that
Yes.
is sort of where we stand now. Does this issue of trust on either side come up in these
All the
thought
time.
processes that
All the
are part
time.
of the problem?
All the time, Bob. It's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. It connects to the other questions, particularly Mary's, because one of the problems we have not being historically educated is we don't understand other societies. Why do we really teach history? It's not just for the facts. It's to empathize. And any of you who have been successful, all of you have been successful. You were successful because you worked with people who you probably didn't fully trust, but you learned to empathize, which is to say you learned to understand where they were coming from. Empathy is different from sympathy. I don't have sympathy for the theocracy in Iran. They're anti-Semitic, they sponsor terrorists. I have no sympathy for them, but I empathize with them. And I empathize with why they are frightened of us. Because we deposed their government to democratically elected, or close to democratically elected government in �53. We have built more than 20 military bases on their borders since we've gone into Iraq. We invaded Iraq. We have drones flying over their society. There are all kinds of reasons why they have reason to be scared of us. I don't think we intend to do them harm, but they have reason to be scared of us. And to your direct question, Bob, in negotiations, I can tell you in my discussions with Iranians, when I talk to Iranians who come to the U.S., politicians and scholars, they always bring up 1953 first. They all know that history, just as we all know 1776. And we have to recognize that, and if we're going to build a relationship with them, we have to build upon that, not deny that. So my position on the Iranian agreement is this. I don't care whether we trust them or we don't trust them. We always work with societies we don't trust in international relations, right? Some of them are our friends and we don't trust them either, right? You know how many Israelis are in prison for spying on the U.S.? Quite a number, actually, right? So we operate in a world where there's a lot of distrust. We need an agreement that allows us to begin to build a relationship, to show them we don't want to do them harm, and gives them the opportunity to show us that they're willing to meet us halfway. I don't know if they will do that, but I think we should try this agreement, and let's test them. And then if they don't, then we've at least made that effort. But to simply say, because we don't trust them, we're not going to deal with them, I'll tell you the truth. I'd rather work with the Iranians and the Saudis. The Saudis are our friend. The Middle East is really, it's about Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Arab world, right? In the Muslim world. And right now, our eggs are in with the Saudis, right? The Saudis are a kingdom that treats human beings in a way none of us would even come close to accepting, right? And it's run by a bunch of 80-year-olds who have a set of princes, about 300 who are going to fight over it. This is a recipe for a civil war and a disaster in the next few years. We are much better served by trying to build a relationship with Iran and acknowledging this history. We are a great society, but we're a society that has made mistakes. Let's acknowledge our mistakes, let's learn from them, and let's try to do better. That's where I come down on this. Thank you.